Okay, cool. So I am ready when you are.
Alrighty. Hate the laughs. It's really awkward when you don't have like somebody you're talking to except like the other person. That's
Wow,
like the really awkward part.
There's 150 people waiting to
Yeah, I
hear
have
you.
to remember that. Alrighty. Welcome everybody. Good morning, good evening, depending on where you're tuning in from.
Oh, that's my
It's like,
Oh man.
Okay.
Welcome to extendsConf, which is our free, independent online event for the Craft CMS community. The last few months have been super difficult and isolating for so many people in our community. And the ongoing pandemic has interrupted a lot of plans and even forced the cancellation of our beloved .all conference this past September.
We know we can't come close to reproducing the magic of an in-person gathering, but we wanted to try to get folks gathered together because even though this year has been really challenging, we know there's a lot of cool work happening in the craft dev community and plenty of ideas worth talking about. So extendsConf is a chance to see some familiar faces, to meet some new ones, and to be inspired and energized by colleagues around the world.
You are watching from our website, extendsconf.com. And if you want to join the conversation, you can hop into our Discord chat channel or our Zoom room, the hallway room for Q&A. The links for both of those are here on the watch page.
During and after each talk, you can put your questions into the chat and our moderator will either relay your question to the speaker or even call on you to unmute and ask your question in person. The purpose of this whole event is to strike up a conversation, so please don't be shy.
Speaking of not being shy, please share your favorite quotes and thoughts and goings on Twitter using our hashtag extendsconf.
Finally, we really want to thank all of our speakers for putting together these presentations. Thank you for doing cool work, being thought leaders, and giving us ideas to rally around and be inspired by.
Without further ado, let's kick it off. Joining us from Austria, we've got Ben to present his latest work, building reactive twig components with Sprig.
Welcome everyone to extendsConf. Today we are going to be discussing a reactive twig framework called Sprig. Now, Sprig is a free plugin for Craft CMS that has gone through 18 beta versions, and it gives me great pleasure to announce today the release of Sprig 1.0. But first things first, what's so great about Sprig and why should you even care about it? Well, let's look at an example together. So let's say that you've been tasked with creating this page which lists 3 article titles. This red asterisk symbolizes that this article has been featured, and each time we click the load more button, there should be a request to server which fetches 3 more articles and displays them as follows. Now there's 2 requirements here. The first one is that each time we click the load more button, that needs to trigger an AJAX request to the server. It's not a case of we're loading all of the entries up front and then just revealing 3 more. We want to dynamically fetch those. And the second requirement is that on page load, these first 3 article titles should be already loaded, so we don't want to rely on JavaScript or a call to the server to fetch those. That would be poor for performance, for SEO, and for accessibility. So that's the task at hand, and the question to you is, how would you go about solving that? Well, you might think of the Elements API, a plugin for Craft CMS that has been around for a long time, which allows you to construct API endpoints and to query those, returning entries essentially. But Craft CMS introduced in 3.3 a GraphQL API, and since that's what all the cool kids appear to be using these days, let's look at how we might approach it using that. So this is the graphical tool, which is an amazing tool available in the Craft CMS control panel with the Pro version enabled. And at first it's a bit overwhelming because there's just comments to read. But the magic really happens when you click on the Explorer button and you see the Explorer sidebar. This allows us to visually construct the query that we want. So what we want to do is we want to fetch entries. We want to specify a limit of 3. We'll need to set an offset. Initially this will be 3 because we'll want to get the next 3, and we'll need to be incrementing this each time by 3 again. We will filter entries or specify the section to be articles. And as you see, as I'm ticking these or as I'm specifying the text, the entry is being constructed for me over in this pane. So now we need to tell GraphQL what we want to retrieve. So we want the title, and we want the featured field, which is a custom field, which means we need to open up this articles entry. I'm guessing that's section, entry type, and element type. And here we can check the featured field. We don't need ID, so I'll uncheck that. And what we end up with is a query that's been constructed for us that we can then execute by tapping this play button, and we see the result, the JSON result, over on the right hand side. So if we were to change the offset to 6, then that would get us the next 3 articles. So this is the query we need. We can already copy this and use this later. So let's look at the code that I've created for this page. We have a very basic HTML page, and I'm pulling in Tailwind from the CDN just to allow us to style that a bit. And most of the logic will happen inside of this div. So here we're looping over all of the entries in the article section. We're limiting them to 3, and we are setting the offset to 0 initially. That will get us the first 3 entries. And here we output the title, and if it's featured, the asterisk. So that's pretty simple, nothing special, nothing new so far. Here we have the load more button with an ID of load more, and down below our JavaScript. So let's look at this one line at a time. We've added an event listener on the load more button so that each time that is clicked, we're going to perform this query. So we're setting an offset to 0 initially, and each time we perform the query, we're incrementing that by 3. Here is our GraphQL query that I just copied in. All I did was I added the offset variable that we've defined up here so that that is dynamic. Everything else is how we constructed it previously. And here we are, we're using the fetch API to call the endpoint which I've defined in GraphQL. This is our GraphQL endpoint. We're sending a post request. We are ensuring that the content type is JSON, and we are JSON stringifying the GraphQL query. Okay, next up, when the response comes back, we interpret it as JSON, and once we get our result, we're simply getting the content div in which we want to insert that. And here we're going to loop over each of the result.data.entries. That's what comes back to us from the GraphQL API. And for each entry that we get back, we are going to append, and we're doing that by appending it to the content div's inner HTML. We're appending a h2 tag followed by the entries.title, and if the entry is featured, then we're outputting the span, and here we close the h2 tag. So that's pretty much all the code we need to make that work. So let me jump over the browser and refresh the page. This is the page is loaded, or the articles are loaded initially, and when we hit the load more button, we get 3 more. And let me open up the network tab so we can see what is actually happening here. I'll refresh. There's the initial page request, which has, there we are, our 3 articles, and I'll hit load more. Here's the API call, and look at the response: data, entries, and then we have an array of article titles and whether they're featured as well. So pretty straightforward so far, and I'm sure that one thing you've noticed is that these articles that are being loaded are actually in a different shade of gray than they are initially. So let's check out what's going on here. So here's my H2, and I'm saying text gray 800, and down here text gray 600. Okay, so let me fix that up, try it again, and there we go, it's working as expected. But that already might tell you or give you an indication of one of the problems with this approach, and that is that we are duplicating our code, or we are recreating our template code that we have up here down here, right? So we're essentially repeating this piece of code, and anytime we want to change something here, like if we wanted to remove a class or add a class, we'd have to do it in 2 places, and that's not very appealing. So let's look at how we might do this with Sprig. Same task. We're going to approach it the same way, but look at how Sprig makes that much easier. So what you'll notice is we're starting off with the same kind of boilerplate, just a Tailwind CSS import, and here we are calling the Sprig function similar to how an include might be used, the include function. And the first thing that we pass in is the name of a template that we have created, and that is going to be our component. It's really just a template, a twig template, but we will see the differences and why we refer to those as components. I've put it in a components folder, but this can be renamed to whatever you want. And here in the second parameter, we can specify variables. So initially I want the offset to be 0, and that will allow us to increment that by 3 each time. There is no JavaScript, as you can see. We output the sprig.script tag, and what that will do is import a JavaScript file for us. Sprig uses the HTMX library, which is a JavaScript library, and that is its only dependency. But how great is this? We haven't had to write a single line of JavaScript code, whereas before, over here we had about 20 lines of code, not including this query, this GraphQL query that we constructed. So let's look at this component, because that's where things get really interesting. So here's our component, and as before, we've created a for loop over the articles. Offset is now a dynamic variable. We passed in a value of 0, as you remember, and we'll be able to increment that within this component. So we're outputting the h2 tag just as before, and here's our button. And what we've done is we've added the Sprig attribute, which tells Sprig that this button should be reactive. In other words, it should react to a user interaction such as a click. And we've used the s-vars, or vars, I should say, attribute to specify that we want the offset to be passed in as a variable, and the offset will be incremented by 3. And if we look at that in the browser, I'll refresh the page and I'll open the network tab so we can see this as well. So when I hit load more, we get the result that we were expecting. And here is an AJAX request that has been sent to us, or sent by Sprig on our behalf. we can see that we passed in, there was the offset variable, plus a few other variables that Sprig uses internally. And notice the response is not JSON data as previously with GraphQL, but just pure HTML. And the nice thing here is that this HTML can just be swapped in to the appropriate place. You're starting to see how easy it is to use Sprig and how quickly you can create reactive components. So just by adding the Sprig attribute onto this button, we've made the button itself reactive, so that each time it's clicked, this entire component, this entire template, is re-rendered server side, and the result of that is swapped into the DOM. Now, there are many more examples here in the Sprig cookbook of what Sprig can do, things like live search, things like, well, we just saw the load more button, pagination in real time, things like filtering, very common use case, loading dynamic content. So this page is actually statically cached, but each time I refresh the page, we will dynamically load 3 new entries. Polling, so every 5 seconds, the time is fetched from the server. An indicator, so that, well, with the prompt too, so we can have long-running processes and an indicator of that, and so on and so forth. There's many things to explore here. Now, I'm sure you're wondering what is coming in Sprig 1.0. I realize I've been keeping you in suspense. But the truth is that Sprig 1.0 is the stamp of approval on the stability of Sprig after 18 beta versions were stable and ready to be used in production. There is, however, one thing that I've been keeping under my hat, which I'd like to show you now. And that is the Sprig Playground. Now, Tailwind Play was released about 2 weeks ago, and they kind of stole my thunder, if I'm honest. But I've subsequently borrowed some of their ideas, and hey, I love Tailwind CSS, who doesn't? So, Sprig Playground, this is available as of 1.0 in the control panel, and over on the left hand side we have the Twig template code for our component, and we also have the ability to inject some component variables. So here is the default example, and when I hit create, over on the right hand side we see the output of this component. We can also see the source code, so we can, and this is useful to see how Sprig kind of manipulates some of these HTML attributes, adding these HX, these are the HTMX JavaScript library specific attributes. And each time I click on this button, which has a Sprig attribute, so it has been Sprigified, we see that this component re-renders itself and that the count is incremented and output here. And this is a really good example because we see how each time I click on this button, well, I might slow this down because I'm not sure if you're going to be seeing this over Zoom. So I've slowed my network down to slow 3G, and now when I click on this button you'll see a spinner up here, and when the request comes back then the number, that count, is incremented. And if we look at the network tab, we see, similar to before, that an AJAX request goes out to the server with some Sprig internal variables, but here is the count that was sent, which is the value 4, and the response that comes back is the actual HTML that is produced from rendering our component, given the count is a value of 4 this time. So it's not 0 as it is on page loader initially. As we passed it in, we can see that the output variable is count of 4, and that means that each time we re-render our component we get a fresh output. a very nice thing that we can also do here is we can save. So we can save our component in its current state, and that is available to us. We're able to share that with other people who have access to the control panel here, and we're also able to view everything that we've previously saved. We're also able to update it, so we can keep changing it and working on it, and we can save it as a new playground, and we can also delete it. So let's look at another example, which is very similar to what we were working on previously. Right, so we're loading the first 3 entries initially, and what we have is this button, this load more button, which we've sprigified by adding this Sprig attribute. And we're saying that when this button is clicked, the offset should be passed in as a variable to the component and set to the value of what offset already is. So initially we're setting it to 0 plus 3, so we're just incrementing it by 3 each time, which will mean that we will get the next 3 and the next 3 entries. So one other thing that I've done is I've made the section, the limit dynamic, so that those we could change over here as well. We could simply change limit to 5, and next time we create the component, we see that reflected there. Now when I click the load more button, we get the next 5 entries, but they're not being appended as they were before. Right, so what we're getting is a situation where this entire component is being re-rendered, and that is the default behavior of Sprig. It will re-render everything and replace it with the result. To get the result that we had previously, we will need to change the target. So s-target will allow us to change that. Notice the autocomplete, and we want to change the target of the result. So whatever will be rendered from this component, instead of replacing the entire component, we just want to replace this element. Essentially what we're doing is we're replacing the load more button by 3 more entries followed by the load more button again, right? So the new entries followed by the load more button. We'll also need to change the swapping behavior. By default, it will swap the inner HTML of the element, and we want to change that to the outer HTML. So we want to swap out the entire button rather than just what's inside of it. Let me change the limit back to 3 so we can get the result that we wanted. And now each time I hit load more, we get that result. So we're swapping the load more button again with the 3 new entries plus the load more button. Okay, let's look at some other examples. Let's look at this, in which we are adding a filter so we can select articles that are featured only. Right, so when I click this or check it, then we get the featured articles. When I uncheck it, we get unfeatured articles. So let's look at that. All we've got is this checkbox input field, and I've added Sprig to it. And if the featured variable is truthy, then we make it checked, otherwise we don't. So initially we're passing it in as 0, and over on the right hand side we can see that it's initially 0, but as soon as I check it, this entire component re-renders itself server side, and we see the output featured has changed to 1. Let's look at one more example here. So in this case we have the featured checkbox is still there, but now we've added this this text input field, or it's actually a number input field, and that is going to represent the limit. So by having input fields inside of our component, we can manipulate the variables. So the limit variable, which we have initially as 3, we now have the value output, and we can manipulate that as follows. And each time I do, Each time I do, the entire component re-renders itself. And now we can use multiple filters together, right? And it's very, very easy to do. So far I've added this Sprig attribute to input elements and buttons, but you can actually add it to any element at all. So I'm going to add it to every H2 tag, and that means that when I click on this, it's, well, I don't know if this is happening too fast for you to see, but each time I click on one of these, this component is being re-rendered. So you can add Sprig, the attribute, to Sprigify pretty much any HTML element in your code. And one really nice side effect of Sprig and of the playground exposes is that if I make a typo or if I add some code that will throw an error, that error is displayed over here so that I really can't not notice it with the line number and the exact issue. So variable xSession does not exist. Let's fix that up. Let's see if I did something here. Calling unknown method craft variable entries at line 8. So at each stage it will throw that error for us provided dev mode is enabled, and we're able to fix that right then and there. One thing actually I discovered while playing with this is I wanted to throw an error here, so I put an S on, and I discovered that that actually returns 1. So I can only assume that that returns the number of titles, but I'd never seen that before. Adding an X though does throw an error as expected. So that's Sprig 1.0 available today. The first stable release of Sprig, ready to be used in production. And maybe a few last things I'd like to say about Sprig. When you might want to use it and when you might not. It's important to remember that each Sprig request is a round trip to the server. Now, because the payload is so small, that generally only takes about 100 milliseconds, which feels pretty much instantaneous to the end user. But if you're doing simple calculations like addition, subtraction, or simply toggling something on, off, showing, hiding, then you may want to just use vanilla JavaScript or a utility library such as alpine.js. Also, if you're already all in on Vue.js or React or a similar JavaScript framework, then they'll often have their own component systems, and it will be easier to communicate with the GraphQL API. So it's really just a case of evaluating what your needs are and what your starting point is. But Sprig is really powerful and really easy to get started with. We just scratched the surface of what you can do with Sprig in this talk. We didn't even look at the attributes that are available to you. We didn't look at how you can use PHP classes as the components so that you can keep your logic in PHP and the output in Twig. There is a lot more for you to explore. And the best part about it is that it's just Twig and some HTML attributes. So there's very little per se to have to learn. Thank you to Jalen and Michael for organizing this great event, and thank you to all of you for attending. I'm looking forward to the discussion and questions that will follow, and I'll see you on the other side.